Hey, what's up? Are you feeling burnt out, stressed, or experiencing high levels of constant anxiety at work? Well, if so, you're not alone. As a matter of fact, a recent article in Forbes estimated that about 66% of Americans are feeling burnt out at work, which is an all-time high. And often it's because of the job, and it's because of the culture that we have at work, and because of the fact that it clashes with your core values. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about values and the importance that values have not only in our personal life, but also in our professional lives at work. So, as always, I'm going to start with a little story that kind of illustrates this point. Now, this happened back in 2018 when I was actually living in Silicon Valley, and I was recently going through a massive transition in my career where I had left my career in tech. I'd been working for 15, 20 years as a tech chief marketing officer in startups, and I'd spent a couple of years at Google working in marketing. And all of a sudden, after a really bad burnout, after a really bad crash and divorce, I'd actually made a career pivot, and I had started to work as an executive coach, working with founders and other business leaders in the Valley. And so one day, like recently after I'd embarked in this new journey and I was working as a coach, I get a call from my ex-wife. And I'm on the phone with her and she's like, hey, something's come up. It's really urgent. I need to sit down and talk with you. Now, for any of you guys out there that are divorced, you know that generally when your ex calls you up and wants to meet with you urgently and talk about something that's important, well, it's not typically good news. And it really wasn't in this case. So, I jumped into my car. I drove down to the nearby Starbucks in Redwood City. I met with my ex-wife and we sit down and have, our decaf mochas or whatever the hell we were drinking. And she slides this envelope across the desk to me, across the table. And I pull out this letter and I start reading it. And it's a letter from her landlord. And the letter is basically like, hey, look, we've decided to put the house on the market. And unless you're willing to bid for the house and buy it, you're going to have to vacate the premises in the next 2 to 3 months because the house is going to be sold. And obviously, my ex was kind of really stressed out and anxious about this because, the kids were at a really good school in the neighborhood. They'd been living in that house for a couple of years. They really liked it. And so this was really, really bad news for her and bad news for us. And I was like, hey, look, don't stress about it. I know that this is like a real setback. I'm going to help you find another place. I'm sure that, hopefully we can find a place in the same neighborhood so the kids don't have to switch schools. So I was trying to reassure her that, things were going to be okay. And I was going to find a way to save the day, right? And then she looks at me and she goes, Patrick, actually, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I don't think I want to stay here anymore. So I was like, well, what do you mean? She's like, well, I think it's time to move, and we need to move and go live somewhere else. And I was like, hey, no worries. There's always San Jose. There's other places where we can live. We can live across the bridge. And she's like, no, you don't really understand. I don't want to stay in California. And I was like, oh my God. Okay. Well, what about, Oregon, or what about Florida, or what about Texas, where we don't have to stay in California, although I prefer to stay in California because obviously we've been living in 10 years in California. I had all my network there, all my friends were there. And she's like, no, I really want to be closer to my parents. My stepfather's been quite sick. I have this business now, in Chile. And all of a sudden I was like, Chile. I was like, you want to move to Chile? I mean, it's like 9,000 miles away on the opposite end of the world, right? And she's like, yeah, I really want to move back to Chile. I think, the kids, deserve to be, given a chance to live in another country and be closer to their grandparents and, experience different culture. And she's like, I'm really fed up and burnt out with, the hustle and grind culture here. And I really want to move. And right there, as you can imagine, we were like at an impasse because, for me, I was just like reinventing myself from a career perspective. I had made a career pivot, but all of my potential clients and customers and companies were all in the Bay Area. And so all of a sudden, she wants to move to Chile. I want to stay in Silicon Valley. We couldn't reach an agreement. Every time we would meet and talk about this, things would get heated. Yeah, things would get really stressed out. And for the next couple of months, we went backwards and forwards on this. And, there was the risk of bringing lawyers involved because, of course, we hadn't settled our divorce. And I was all of a sudden thinking to myself, as I'm sure, any of you would think, especially the guys out there, I was like, oh my God, if my ex moves to Chile, when am I ever going to see my kids? It's like, that was really stressing me out. And I was agonizing with this decision because on the one hand, there was, my new career, my friends, my connections, the fact that I lived in the Bay Area. And now, of course, there was this new opportunity that my ex-wife wanted to do to move to Chile. And I struggled and struggled and struggled on this. And the thing that really helped me get clarity and make a decision was I was working with my coach, and we went through a series of exercises, which I'm going to share with you guys today. And that helped me get a lot of clarity on my values, and actually not just get clarity, but actually figure them out, help prioritize which values were more important than others, and then help define what that meant in terms of how to live my life according to my values. And it was when I figured out that one of my values was the good father, as I call it. And I defined that value very clearly in terms of what that meant. What does it mean to be a good father? That I actually came to the conclusion, which was really sobering, it was a difficult decision to make. And I was like, hey, man, if I'm going to be a good father, I'm going to have to bite the bullet. I'm going to have to leave the Bay Area. I'm going to have to relocate to Santiago, Chile. I'm going to have to start my career all over again in another country, in another language, in a culture which is not mine. And that ended up being, a big part of my best-selling book, Step Back and Leap, was making that decision, and subsequently what ensued when I moved to this new country. So the point I'm making here, man, is when we have clarity on our values, that doesn't mean that our decisions all of a sudden become easy to make, but they become simpler. Because when you live your life according to your values, all of a sudden, you know that if you have a certain core value like freedom, autonomy, family, whatever that's important to you, then, it helps reduce your anxiety and your stress levels and the risk of burnout to decide to live in accordance to your values, right? And so the reality is, when we start living our lives this way, when we allow our values to drive our decision-making, it makes life simpler and less stressful. That doesn't mean that executing on decisions easy. Moving to Chile was not the easiest thing that I've ever done, but actually it removes this pain point and it makes decision-making simpler, okay? So what does that mean for you? Like, if you're listening to this, and you're like, okay, well, that's great. If I can figure out my values, maybe that's going to simplify my life and make things a lot more clear for me. How do I actually figure this out? So here's what I want you to do. There is a tool that you can use online. If you go to a website called thinktoperform.com, and don't worry, this is all going to be in the show notes, and I'll leave it in the description of this podcast. If you go to thinktoperform.com/values, there's an exercise there called the value cards exercise. And what the value cards exercise allows you to do is it allows you to basically triage, kind of to like, you're going to go through your values, and you're going to start with your top 50. Then you're going to work down to your top 25. Then you're eventually going to work down to your top 5. And once you have those top 5 values, then you're going to actually define those values in 2 to 3 sentences to help personalize those values, right? Because, like, let's say I value freedom. That's wonderful, but freedom means different things to different people. So what I want you to do is actually figure out your top 5 values and then define them according to what that means to you. Now, if you are a founder or business owner or leader, then the next part of this podcast could be super interesting for you, because we're going to talk about, well, what does that mean in terms of your company culture? And what does that mean in terms of leadership? How do I actually take these values and mirror them in my organization or with my team? So get ready. Here we go into the business context of why values are so important. Now, maybe you've heard of this. Have you ever heard of this term, which is like culture eats strategy for breakfast? Well, you might have heard that, right? And if you haven't had breakfast, hopefully I'm not making you hungry. But that is more and more true. Why? Because business is moving faster and faster. And if you're kind of like, aware at all of what's happening in the context of technological changes, artificial intelligence, large language models, and how this is changing the way we work, you're realizing that our world is moving ever faster and that we have to make decisions more quickly. What does that mean from a business perspective? That means that increasingly, when we are driven by our culture and our values, that allows us to make decisions more quickly, and decisions are simpler and clear, right? So culture in a company, it's not about like free food or like, you have slides, going from the second floor of the building to the first floor. You have all these perks and foosball tables. That is not company culture. Okay. When I was at Google, yes, we had all these things. That was not what made Google Google. What made Google Google was the fact that we would make incredibly difficult business decisions based on the culture of the company. What do I mean by that? Well, take an example. In 2010, for those of you guys who remember back then, Google was forced to make a really difficult decision, which was to leave the Chinese market. Now, obviously, from a company point of view, when you make a business decision like this based on your values, it can cost you millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of dollars in revenue. And so for Google, the decision of whether or not to stay in China was a really difficult one, and it was going to cost the company billions of dollars if they left. They made the decision to leave China. Why did they do that? Because Google's mission was to make the world's information universally accessible and useful in a single click, right? It's to provide information as easily and as transparently as possible to its users. Obviously, when a government comes, any government comes, and they tell you that you have to limit your search results, or you have to filter your search results, or censor them in any kind of way that does not allow you to live up to your mission, that directly contradicts with your purpose as a company and with your culture as a company. And so Google realized that if they stayed in China, and if they decided to continue to operate based on the dictates of the Chinese regime, which is, that's a choice, that was going to conflict with their values as a company, and that was going to conflict with their culture, and potentially they were going to lose business elsewhere, and potentially they're going to lose a lot of employees. So as you can see, when you make a business decision based on your values as a company, on the one hand, it gives you a lot of clarity and makes the decision-making process easier. That doesn't mean that you might not take a short-term hit in the business, right? So when we decide to deliberately live our values as a company, decisions become easier to make. We get much more clarity. It's much easier to explain this to our employees. It translates into stronger culture, and it has a massive impact on our organization. How, for example? Well, one impact it has is that it has a massive impact on retention. When you have a strong company culture like you do in companies, whether it's a new startup or a unicorn or an established Fortune 500 company like, a Google, a Microsoft, an Apple, Patagonia, Airbnb, companies that are very strong in terms of their culture, Nike and Disney are other great examples, then your ability to retain talent is much happier because people stay in your company because they're less stressed. And they're less stressed oftentimes because they're working in a way that the company's values are aligned to their values. So it has a big impact on retention. Where else does it have a big impact? It has a big impact in actual hiring. Because when you're hiring people based on values, not just based on abilities or experience, oftentimes you actually make better hires, right? For example, my last startup, Leap, one of our values with growth was growth mindset. So whenever we were interviewing people, we had a list of questions that different members of the team would ask candidates to ascertain whether the candidate really lived the growth mindset or not. And as good as a candidate was, as smart as they were, or whether we thought they could do the job, if they didn't have a growth mindset, we wouldn't hire them. Why? Because it contradicted with our values, and it contradicted with the way that we ran the company. So, it also impacts how we lead, right? So when I have clarity on my values, and I choose to lead and manage my people in a way that is in accordance with those values, I'm being much more congruent with my values, right? So, for example, if I'm a leader and I value freedom, and people on my team value autonomy, but I'm micromanaging people, well, there's a freaking disconnect, right? There's a disconnect. And that is what drains people of energy, what pisses them off, and what leads to burnout, right? So values have a massive impact in the way that we choose to lead our lives, but they also have a massive impact on how we choose to operate and lead and manage at work, right? Okay, so what can you do next? Well, like I said, my podcast, if you know me and if you know anything about me and you know anything about my book, is all about translating theory into action, right? Theory is great, but if you don't actually move to massive action, like Tony Robbins always says, if you don't take massive action, if you don't take any kind of action, all this stuff is useless, and it just was an entertaining podcast. So what I want you to do is two things. First is go to thinktoperform.com/values, do the values exercise. Next, I want you to actually spend 20 minutes and define each one of your core values in 2 or 3 sentences, no more. Third, I want you to pick one of those values, and I want you to decide to live intentionally according to that value. Think of, what does that mean in terms of your relationships with people at home? How do I need to treat my kids differently? How do I need to treat my partner differently? How do I need to treat my friends differently? And from a work perspective, how do I work, lead, and manage in accordance with that value. And lastly, what I want you to do is, because sharing is caring, but also sharing actually makes us accountable, is share that intention with somebody else. If you're going to lead according to your values at work, share this with your team. Hey guys, one of my core values is freedom. I'm going to try and be more intentional about leading with freedom in mind. I want you guys to hold me accountable. Tell me when I'm being aligned with that value. Tell me when I'm not aligned with that value. Okay. So anyway, guys, that is the podcast for today. I hope you guys got a lot out of this. Again, the description and the guide to my Mork's guide of living with value is going to be in the show notes. The link to Think to Perform will be in the show notes as well. If this was helpful, please share this podcast with others. You can leave some comments. If you're listening to this podcast in a place where you can leave comments, share with others, enjoy it. I hope you'll join us on our next episode where we will be interviewing a special guest who is going to give us stories and tangible actions of how they implemented values in their own organization, how they lead with values, and what that means for you. Hope this was a great episode for you. See you in the next one. Peace. Talk to you soon.